Hi, this is Toby from Toby Urban Sketch. I'm going to take you through a 12-minute tutorial how to produce a really nice expressive chaffinch, in this case, from a simple line drawing. The start here, I've just done a line drawing using my trusty preppy fountain pen and some carbon black ink. You could also use a fine liner. And the key is, you can see here when I'm putting water on the page, it's not running. Not at all, it's completely water fast. This is the key to expressive painting, because you want a wet on wet technique to really let the watercolour you're going to put on bleed all over. So what I've been doing there is just putting some water on those reddy brown areas on the chaffinch. You don't want to put water everywhere, because then the colours will immediately bleed into each other and you'll get an unintentional mess. But some water in just key areas which all look the same. Next, I've picked out a primary red. So this is Scarlet Lake by Winsor Newton. I'm just putting in a really faint wash in a few areas which really have that definite reddy orange to them. And then, having done the faint wash, just coming in again with a bit more pigment on the brush and just dabbing it around, creating interesting textures and letting it bleed through the paper. I'm not being fussy about sticking to the lines. I want a really clean line between the breast and the wing, but I'm actually purposefully going over the front. And I purposely went over the front of the bird's breast as well with water to give that really splashy, dynamic, alive look to the painting in the end. So I'll keep going with the paper still wet and add a bit more pigment, just making sure I've got some bright alive colours. With this first wash, you don't want it to be all the colour. We're going to come back in again, so don't worry what it looks like too much now. And I'm just going to move to the back of the bird, applying some burnt sienna, and then for a bit more contrast I put some sepia. You could use another dark pigment like a Payne's Grey is a really common one to have in the palette. So I've given those areas a bit of time to dry, so you can see the colours dulled down. And now these last remaining big white areas, I'm just putting some water in again. I've picked out the two bluey grey bits, the head and the top of the wing. And I'm using a cerulean blue here. It's a Winsor Newton colour again, and it's really nicely granulating. It's not the brightest of blue, but in that case this works really well. So they're just doing a very similar thing, layering and layering. You can see, because it's granulating, it provides a really interesting texture. Especially on rough paper like this, the pigment tends to pool in all the crevices that naturally exist in the paper. So the next thing is to add a little bit of those highlights. So there's a sort of yellowy white in little areas of the bird, and I tried with my line drawing just to give myself some shapes to work in where they'd be. And all I'm doing is just putting a lemon yellow, in this case another Winsor Newton lemon yellow, into those areas, and then also into a couple of the areas around the bird which are just a little bit brighter. So just under the beak's quite bright, for example, and just under the bottom of the bird there's quite a lot of highlighted reflected colours. I've given everything a while to dry now, and so it's time for the second wash of colour. So with all the time to dry with watercolour, the pigments tend to become a bit duller, so we can come in again and be really strong and brave with how much pigment we're putting down. This is the same Scarlet Lake red, and again just letting it bleed all over, just paying attention to the reference photo, having a look at how different strengths of colour, different contrasts, different tones are in different areas, and still making sure we leave plenty of white on the page. Now I'm going to come back in, do the same thing with the head and that top bit of the wing, putting more of that cerulean blue down where the highest contrast areas are. The nice thing about the cerulean blue is because it's quite a dull blue, you can use it with a little bit of red or orange to create shadows, and that's what I'm doing now. So all around underneath the bird, there's a definite shadow. That's where I've put some hatching with my line drawing, but just to make it a bit more convincing, a bit more 3D, I'm going back in with this cerulean blue shadow, and also taking that shadow down the legs and onto the sort of twig. I think it's actually an icicle that the starling's sitting on. So the next step you can probably guess is to bring a bit more contrast to the back of the bird. So just going in again, this is with the sepia, a bit more sepia, getting a bit more bleed of colour at the back of the bird, a bit more contrast along the natural line in the image, which is again the very back of the bird. Now with all the other painting and a bit of waiting around as well, I've given the tail plenty of time to mostly dry. I don't want it completely dry because I want some of that natural bleeding between the colours to occur here as well. But I also don't want to lose those yellows. And if it was completely wet when we're putting this dark pigment down, we'd lose, well, any of the yellow probably. They just turn into a light brown all over the back of the tail. The colour I've used is a mix of sepia and French ultramarine. That gives a really neutral and dark colour. You could also use burnt sienna and French ultramarine. That's a really common way of making a neutral dark shade tone. So I'm now going to use the same mix of sepia and French ultramarine to again just highlight natural lines. There's the front of the bird, the top of the bird. These areas have got an increase in tone compared to the background, and they're also really good just to highlight in quite a graphic, illustrative image like this, just to make it a really clear-cut thing that you're looking at. Okay, so I've let it dry now for about 10 minutes, and it's time for the fun and quite scary bit where you think, I quite like this, but am I going to ruin it with the final touches? What I'm going to do is just add some splashes. So where the colour's already bled out, put lots of pigment on my brush and just flick onto the page. You get lots of nice dots, and then you can go in gently with the brush and just dab on some of those dots to just expand them, give them a bit more life. Going to then do the same with a couple of other colours. So at the top with the sepia here, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. And again, just expanding some of those dots by touching the canvas with the paper. And then just to give it a little bit more symmetry and get some lighter colours back in, going with that lemon yellow. So splash above the tail where it's bleeding out naturally, and then a few splashes just in front of the bird. So not quite done yet, just the last little details. So just using a mix this time of cerulean blue and some sepia just to give a really gentle tone to the bottom half of the beak, give it a more 3D shape. And then going back in with my mix of sepia and French ultramarine to give a bit more contrast and shape just under the wing and to the front of the bird, just so it's really clear what we're looking at in the final image. And there we are, the finished piece. Just took about 15 or 20 minutes real time with some extra time waiting between washes. If you enjoyed doing it, if you've got any questions, let me know, and of course please subscribe and like. Let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like me to paint in the future. Have a good day.